Hi guys, and welcome to the Nafi Effect. Today is Tuesday, September 17th, 2024. September, back to school time, yeah? School is in full session. So thank you for joining me. As I say, this platform is going to be a lot about me as it is about my business and my family and my journey in life. As a lot of you know that I am one of those persons that have been exposed to things as a child that no child should have been exposed to, and it has taken me decades to come to terms with it and to be a better person, to rise above it. And I want to use this platform as a way and means of sharing my story, or the parts of it I want to share in full with you guys, and how I rose above all that abuse, all that abandonment. So if we go back, a lot of you know, if you knew me when I was a little girl, then you know me as Shawnafi Christie with the FIE. And then if you knew me by the time I left St. Thomas, then you would have known me as Shawnafi Simpson. So who am I really? I was born to a 19-year-old mother. Yeah, 19-year-old mother. I was actually born in Portmore, St. Thomas, not Bath, but the family lived in Bath. My early years, it was between Waterhouse in Kingston, Seaview Gardens, a place called Dalvery in St. Thomas, Dalvery, Duck and Field, somewhere there. And eventually, when I was about 2 years old, I ended up in Bath with my grandmother. So Bath St. Thomas holds a very special place for me, because it is here that it's the only time I've had a childhood. It's the only time in my life that I've had stability. It's the only time in my life that I was Shawnafi, yeah? So how did I end up in Bath with my grandmother? Part one. So as I say, guys, my mother became pregnant back in the days. This was in the end of the 70s. So back in the days, it wasn't acceptable, even though she was 19, to be a teenage mom. Because what happened is my grandmother had sent my mother to Kingston, thinking that she was going to get access to education with an aunt of hers. So my mother's sister then. Not of mine, but my mother's sister, who at the time lived in Seaview Gardens, or this is how the story I've been told. The sister that lived in Seaview Garden, she was working. She had her own home and all of those kind of stuff. Yes, and she had her children. So my grandmother was under the impression that my mother was basically going to school in Kingston, and that really wasn't the case. And this was quite common back in the days, yeah. So somehow my mother, she went into the entertainment and music scene, and you know what happened when young girls go in those days. So one of the men that she interacted with, scientist, may his soul rest in peace, Roy Palmer from Waterhouse, he sent her off to the police academy, or so it has been told to me. He sent her off to the police academy, and she came back with a baby. Not exactly what the pregnancy. So she got pregnant. So she got pregnant, and life was struggling for them in Kingston. It was struggling. The political violence, the poverty. I remember my mother telling stories of them having to go to Riverton to really get food. I don't know how true it is, but that's the story that I was told. So she could not, so in the latter stage of her pregnancy, she went back to St. Thomas because she couldn't manage in Kingston. She went back to St. Thomas. I was born at the Port Morant Maternity Center. So almost like a hospital then, maternity center. It took about 3 days for me to be born. So I'm not sure if I'm really celebrating my right birthday because I was born breech, yeah? Foot first. And at the time I was told that my mother was a practicing Jehovah's Witness. So she had refused all sort of intervention, yeah? So I was born, and she went back. She initially went back to Kingston, but at the same time, guys, what you have to understand, she had friends. She had a friend. His name was Teller. He was an electrician. At one point, he was one of my fathers. And then she had another friend, an older man. I can't quite remember his name, but Mr. Walker. That was from Dalvey or Duckenfield. Yeah. And somehow, I don't know if it's out of means or out of needs, she ended up in Duckensfield. And at the time when she ended up in Duckensfield or Dalvey, it's neighboring communities, I'm not sure which one, I also had an aunt that lived in that neighborhood, and I also had a cousin who has a child as old as I am that lives in that neighborhood also. So, oh Lord, how do we explain this? So what I understand from my early days, I was I grew up, or from my early days, it was those two men who thought that they were my fathers, the two men in Duckenfield. And then there was another man, Mr. Christie, Policeman Christie. If you're from St. Thomas, then you know exactly who that is, Inspector Christie, who also thought he was my father, but we'll come back to him later on. So as I said, my mother was hanging around with either of these two men in Duckenfield and my aunt. But one of them, Mr. Walker, was especially abusive. I think the one called Teller, my grandmother liked him very, very much. Maybe because he had promised us electricity, a promise that never came to fruition. And I left St. Thomas in, what, 1990? Yeah, 91. But anyhow, guys, as the story goes, Mr. Walker was very much abusive. I don't know if it was a jealousy, I don't know if it was alcoholism, but he was very much abusive to my mother. So when my aunt, my mother's sister, who also lived in the same neighborhood, who could not take it anymore, she took me one day to my grandmother's house in Bath, and basically that was where I grew up, or spent the first 10-11 years of my life with my grandmother, who mothered me, Miss Ida Nelson, may her soul rest in peace. So I went about. My grandmother lived in a very, very small house, 2 rooms. And at various times, we could be anywhere between 10 and 15 grandchildren there. Partly because, people die and then their children come in, or poverty hits one sister. My grandmother had 10 children alive. Yeah, poverty hits someone and then they had to send their children there, or somebody was in an abusive relationship and they have to send their children there. So so this is around, we're going to fast forward, guys, to around when I was 2-3 years old. I think that was when I first met the man that became my father until I was 11 years old, Mr. Christie. But during the time I was at my grandmother, I remember very clearly, up until I was probably in the 5th, 6th, no, not the 5th, the 6th grade. Yeah, common entrance. I'm the common entrance generation. Both Teller and Mr. Walker used to visit me, and they visited me in the capacity of being my father. So they always came with things. Yeah, they always came with things to visit, to take to my grandmother and to me. But by this time, I was already getting close to who everybody believed was my father, and the person whose name I bore, though I never had a birth certificate, and I never had a birth certificate until I was 12 years old. So really, do not ask me how I went to high school without a birth certificate. Do not ask me any of those. I will answer them in further videos. But so Mr. Christie, at the time, he was stationed at the Morant Bay. He was a married man with his children. So he was stationed at the Morant Bay police station, but the Bath police station was like a satellite station to him. So he would come once a week back, back in those black police Land Rovers, or yeah, Land Rovers. So he would come, and everybody, I was treated specially because after all I was policeman Christie's child. And apart from that, I was also very brilliant, academically brilliant. I could read very early. I remember that at 2 years old I could spell the word xylophone. Fast forward, guys, to 1984 and a 5-year-old Shawnafi. So 1984, 1983, I can't quite remember the year now. 1983, sorry. My aunt died. So the aunt that lived in Seaview Gardens died. And she had 5 children, but 4 of them were living with her as one was already living overseas. Yeah. And when she died of cancer, I think cervical cancer. She died in Kingston. Is buried at the Maypen Cemetery in Kingston. So when she died, her children, my older cousins, the cousins I grew up with, came to live with my grandmother. And in hindsight and looking back, it must have been traumatic for them to be leaving all the comforts of Kingston. Yeah, where they had television, they had electricity, they had everything. And here they are, these 4 kids, yeah? They were born, the youngest at the time was born in 1975, I think, or 74. 74 or 75, yeah, twins. So it must have been very, very traumatic for my cousins to leave Kingston where they had everything. It was pretty much like they were overseas then. And to come, here they are, coming to a house with my grandmother's house that was already shared by myself and 2 other cousins. And occasionally my aunt from Portland, Auntie Flora, when her husband was abusing her. And here they are now coming to a house. No electricity, no running water, Walkland dog kitchen outside, lots of animals to take care of, a pit toilet that I can't remember how many times I have fell into that toilet, but we will talk about that going later on. And a grandmother that was grieving because their mother, until she died, was my grandmother's favorite child. She spoke so proudly of Gloria. Yeah, if you hear me say Gloria or Auntie Millicent, it's the same person. Her second born, I think it is. She spoke so. So a grandmother that, as a step-grandfather, because what it is, my grandmother had a step-grandfather, had a husband, I'll say her husband, they were not formally married, but at the same time, I also had my grandfather, my mother's father, that was very, very involved in, that was very, very involved in my life, and for all intended purposes still loved my grandmother. So I grew up in that big extended family. What I must also say to you guys is that I am a St. Thomas Maroon. So on one side I grew up in the Maroon and African culture, and in the other side I grew up in the African culture. So I have seen a lot. So anyhow, in 1984 my cousins came to live with us, and looking back, it was a traumatic experience for them. So when we continue this series, I will tell you what happened in 1984, and already there at 1983, 84, already there at 3-4 years old, when I started the infant school, Miss Jackson Infant School, basic school, where innocence was already lost. Already there at in 1984, and I was born in the end of the 70s. So guys, thank you for listening. I'll keep it short this time, and we will continue another time when I tell you more about the making of Nafi, CEO and founder of the 7 Naturals brand.